The most terrifying thing about telling the truth is not that no one will believe you. It is that they will believe you and do nothing anyway. Roger Boisjoly wrote those words in 1987. He wrote them after Challenger, after 7 people were dead, after the commission had reviewed the documents and confirmed every detail of his account, after the world had read his memos and understood, clearly and without ambiguity, that he had been right. He wrote them not with anger, with exhaustion. There is a difference. His name does not appear in most textbooks. It should. This video is about 5 people, 5 different disasters, 5 different decades, different countries, different fields. One pattern that does not change. Each of them saw what was coming. Each of them tried to stop it. Each of them produced evidence. Each of them went through the correct channels, filed the correct reports, spoke to the correct people in the correct rooms. Each of them was right. And each of them discovered that being right in an institution that has decided not to listen is not a protection. It is a vulnerability. We are not going to call them heroes today. Hero is a word institutions use after the fact. After the disaster has happened, after the death toll is confirmed, after the commission has reported, after there is no longer any cost to saying the right thing. At that point, institutions will find the person who warned them, if that person is still alive, and will call them a hero. This word does the work of closing the case. It turns a systemic failure into an individual story. It suggests the system produced a hero rather than that the system produced a catastrophe that a single individual tried to prevent at personal cost. We are going to use different words today. The last mission the Challenger shuttle ever flew was on January 28, 1986. It was a Tuesday morning. The launch had already been delayed 6 times. The temperature at Kennedy Space Center that morning was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest launch day temperature in the entire shuttle program's history by a significant margin. At the joints of the solid rocket boosters, the temperature had dropped to near freezing overnight. There was ice on the launch structure. Technicians had photographed it. The night before, Roger Boisjoly made a phone call. Boisjoly was a senior engineer at Morton Thiokol, the company under contract with NASA to design and manufacture the solid rocket boosters. He had been raising concerns about the O-rings for more than 6 months. The O-rings were circular rubber seals embedded at the joints of the rocket boosters. Their function was critical. They prevented superheated combustion gases from escaping through the joint during launch. If the O-ring failed to seat correctly, the gases would breach the seal. The consequences of a breach at launch were not theoretical. They were engineering certainties. Everyone in the program knew this. Boisjoly had documented, in writing, in formal internal memos, with photographs and test data, that the O-rings became dangerously less pliable in cold temperatures. As temperature dropped, the rubber became stiffer, slower to seat into the joint groove, more likely to allow gases to escape in the critical seconds before the seal fully engaged. He had first raised this concern in internal meetings. Then he formalized it. In July of 1985, 7 months before the Challenger launch, he wrote a memo to his immediate supervisor. The memo was direct. It stated that the O-ring erosion problem had reached a critical level, that the situation was getting worse, that a catastrophic failure could result, and that the potential existed for a disaster of the highest order, loss of human life. The memo was addressed to Morton Thiokol's Vice President of Engineering. It was received. It was marked received. It was not acted upon. Boisjoly raised the issue again in subsequent months. He was not the only engineer who saw the problem. A colleague, Arnie Thompson, had come to the same conclusions independently. They shared their concerns in internal meetings. The launches continued. On the evening of January 27, 1986, a teleconference was arranged between Morton Thiokol engineers, Morton Thiokol management, and NASA officials at the Marshall Space Flight Center. The engineers knew the next morning's forecast temperature. They had assembled their data. Boisjoly and his team presented charts, photographs, and analysis correlating O-ring damage with temperature across previous launches. Their recommendation was unambiguous. Do not launch until temperatures rose to at least 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the lowest temperature at which they had data showing acceptable O-ring performance. The reaction from NASA managers was not receptive. One official at Marshall said he was appalled by the recommendation. He said, in words that appear verbatim in the Rogers Commission record, that thiocol was trying to change the launch commit criteria. Another official asked a question that became significant later. He asked when thiocol wanted him to launch, implying that the engineers were trying to delay indefinitely. The tone of the exchange was pressure. The pressure was not subtle. Morton Thiocol's senior management then asked for a 5-minute caucus off the line. The engineers, Boisjoly and Thompson, and the others who had assembled the data were excluded from this caucus. Management deliberated privately. When they came back on the line, they had reversed the engineers' recommendation. They approved the launch. The approval was telephoned to Kennedy Space Center that night. Boisjoly went home. He could not sleep. He told his wife that night that he was afraid people were going to die the next day. He said it plainly. She remembered it later because of the plainness of it. Not dramatic, not uncertain. A prediction delivered in the tone of a man who had done everything he could think to do. Challenger launched at 11:38 the following morning. 73 seconds after launch, a flame became visible at one of the solid rocket booster joints. It grew. It reached the external fuel tank. The tank failed. The vehicle disintegrated at 65,000 feet. All 7 crew members were killed. Krista McAuliffe, who was going to be the first teacher in space, died alongside the mission specialists and astronauts who had trained for years for this flight. Her students were watching from the ground. The Rogers Commission established the cause: O-ring failure at a joint in the right solid rocket booster, caused by the cold temperature compromising the O-ring's ability to seal the joint correctly. The failure mechanism was exactly what Boisjoly had described in his July 1985 memo. Boisjoly testified before the Rogers Commission. He brought his memos. He described the teleconference in detail. He did not soften the account. He said what had happened in sequence with documentation. Morton Thiocol did not respond well to this. He was removed from the shuttle program. He was isolated within the company, given a nominal position with no responsibilities, in an office away from the engineering teams. His colleagues largely stopped interacting with him. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder. He suffered chest pains and difficulty with memory. He resigned from Morton Thiocol. His marriage suffered. His health suffered. He relocated to Colorado. For the remaining decades of his life, he traveled to universities and engineering schools and gave lectures on ethics, not on heroism, on the specific institutional mechanisms by which a warning becomes a liability and a warning's author becomes a problem. He talked about the caucus, about the phrase management decision, about what it means to be excluded from the room. He died on January 6, 2012, 26 years after the launch. He had lived long enough to see the shuttle program retired and the hardware placed in museums. He had lived long enough to be recognized by historians, by ethics educators, by the engineering community. He had lived long enough to watch the institutional acknowledgement arrive a quarter-century too late for the 7 people on the vehicle. The failed O-ring from Challenger is displayed at the National Air and Space Museum. The exhibit explains what failed and why. It does not mention the name of the engineer who spent 7 months trying to prevent it. Ignaz Semmelweis was born in 1818 in Budapest, then part of the Austrian Empire. He studied medicine in Vienna. He was intelligent, thorough, and, based on the historical record, not particularly easy to work with. This last detail matters because institutions tend to use character as a reason to dismiss the work. In 1846, he was appointed as an assistant in the first obstetric clinic at Vienna General Hospital. The hospital had 2 maternity wards. The first clinic was staffed by medical doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed by midwives. The difference in mortality rates between the 2 wards was not a new observation. It had been documented for years. The mortality rate in the first clinic from childbed fever, puerperal fever, ran at roughly 10% of all admissions in bad months and averaged close to that over the years. The second clinic ran at roughly 4%. Women in Vienna who were pregnant and who knew about the hospital had a clear preference. They begged to be admitted to the second clinic. Some delivered in the street and requested admission as outdoor patients, because outdoor admissions defaulted to the second clinic rather than enter the first clinic. This is documented. The fear was that concrete and that rational. The institution was aware of the disparity. The explanations offered were varied. The second clinic had better air circulation, some said. Women in the first clinic were more likely to be examined by male students and became embarrassed, which weakened their constitution. The germ theory of disease did not yet exist. The concept of infection transmission was not established medicine. Physicians operated, delivered babies, and performed autopsies in the same working day, wearing the same coat, washing with water and perhaps soap if convenient, and did not regard this as a problem because no one had yet established that it was one. In 1847, a colleague and close friend of Semmelweis, Jacob Kolechka, died. Kolechka had been accidentally punctured by a student's scalpel during an autopsy. He developed a fever. His condition deteriorated in a progression that Semmelweis recognized immediately. He died of what appeared to be systemic infection. His symptoms matched, almost exactly, the symptoms Semmelweis had been watching women die of in the first clinic for a year. The connection Semmelweis made was this: the first clinic's doctors and students spent their mornings in the pathology department performing autopsies and then came directly to the maternity ward to examine patients and assist with deliveries. They did not change their coats. They did not wash beyond a cursory rinse with water. They were carrying something from the dead to the living. Semmelweis could not name what they were carrying. The language and science for that would not exist for another 20 years. But he understood the transfer. He understood that Kolechka had died from a wound that introduced into his bloodstream whatever substance was on the student's scalpel. And he understood that the doctor's hands were performing the same function on the women in the ward. He ordered hand-washing with a chlorinated lime solution before anyone entered the maternity ward. He mandated this for himself and his staff. He tracked the outcomes. In May of 1847, the mortality rate in his ward ran at 12%. After he introduced the hand-washing protocol, it dropped to 2% by June. By the following year, it was below 1%. The data was consistent. It was reproducible. It was recorded. He presented his findings to his colleagues and superiors. They did not accept them. The objections were multiple. His theory implied that physicians had been causing patient deaths, that the hands of doctors were instruments of transmission. This was not a claim that the medical establishment of 1847 Vienna was prepared to absorb. The self-conception of the physician as healer was incompatible with the idea of the physician as vector. Additionally, Semmelweis could not explain the mechanism. He could show the data. He could demonstrate the correlation and the improvement. But he could not explain why the chlorinated lime worked, because he did not know about bacteria. His critics argued, and they were not stupid men, that without a theoretical mechanism, a statistical correlation proved nothing. They were wrong. They were methodologically coherent in their wrongness. and they continued to deliver babies with unwashed hands. He was denied a permanent position in Vienna. He returned to Budapest, where he implemented his protocol at St. Rochus Hospital and later at the University of Pest. Wherever he worked, he introduced the hand-washing requirement. Wherever he introduced it, mortality rates dropped. The data continued to accumulate. He published his major work, The Etiology, Concept, and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, in 1861. It was 843 pages. It was poorly received. The critical reviews were dismissive. Some were hostile. He began writing open letters to the prominent obstetricians of Europe. The letters called them irresponsible. He said that every professor of obstetrics who refused to implement hand-washing was killing patients. He was not wrong. He was also not communicating in a way that changed minds. He was a man who had watched the evidence accumulate for a decade and watched colleagues ignore it and watched women die, and the letters became the output of that accumulation. In the summer of 1865, colleagues arranged for Semmelweis to be committed to a mental institution in Vienna. He was 47 years old. He was taken there on July 31st. He died on August 13th, 14 days later. The official cause was listed as septicemia, blood poisoning. Several historical analyses of his autopsy records suggest that his injuries at the time of death were consistent with having been beaten. The records from the asylum are incomplete. The details of his final days are not reconstructed. He died of an infection strikingly similar to the disease he had spent 18 years trying to prevent. Louis Pasteur published his foundational germ theory work in the 1860s. Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgical practice in 1867, 2 years after Semmelweis died. Within a generation, hand-washing in clinical settings had become standard medical protocol worldwide. Semmelweis was recognized as a pioneer. There are statues of him in Vienna and Budapest. A medical university bears his name. His portrait has appeared on postage stamps. He did not live to see any of it. The vindication arrived exactly as it always does in these stories, after the person who earned it was already gone. The Kerr-McGee Corporation operated a plutonium processing facility outside Crescent, Oklahoma. The plant manufactured plutonium fuel rods for the United States Atomic Energy Commission. It employed several hundred workers. The work involved handling plutonium and other radioactive materials. Plutonium, ingested or inhaled, even in minute quantities, is among the most acutely toxic substances known. Its biological half-life in bone tissue is measured in decades. The workers at Kerr-McGee were issued film badges to measure their exposure. The badges recorded what they recorded. Whether anyone acted on the recordings was a different matter. Karen Silkwood began working at the plant in 1972. She was trained as a laboratory analyst. She processed and tested plutonium samples. She was 26 years old when she started. She had 3 children. She was also a union member, a member of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International Union, which represented workers at the Kerr-McGee facility. In 1974, she was elected to her local union's negotiating committee. The committee was gathering documentation on safety conditions at the plant in preparation for contract negotiations. Silkwood began examining the records more closely. What she found, according to her own accounts and to the testimony of people who spoke with her during this period, was a pattern of problems. Contamination incidents that had been inadequately reported, quality control records for the fuel rods that she believed had been falsified, and a general culture in which the correct procedures for handling radioactive material were shortcuts as often as they were followed. She brought her concerns to the union at the national level. By October of 1974, she had agreed to gather evidence and present it to the AEC and to a journalist at the New York Times named David Burnham, who had been investigating nuclear industry safety practices. She was building a file. On November 5, 1974, Silkwood was found to be contaminated with plutonium. A routine nasal swab, taken as part of the plant's standard monitoring program, came back positive. She was contaminated at a level of 40 times the permissible body burden for plutonium. Her hands and forearms were also contaminated. Over the following days, the contamination extended. On November 7th and 8th, she was found to be contaminated again during routine monitoring. On November 9th, a health physics team was sent to examine her apartment. The apartment itself was contaminated. Surfaces in the bathroom and kitchen showed plutonium contamination at significant levels. The package of bologna in her refrigerator was contaminated. Her bathroom showed the highest contamination levels measured anywhere in the investigation. The source of the apartment contamination was never officially determined. Kerr-McGee later suggested that Silkwood might have contaminated the apartment herself, perhaps to support her claims against the company. This theory required believing that a woman with children, who understood what plutonium does to human tissue, deliberately ingested or scattered plutonium in her own living space. The company's theory was not supported by physical evidence of the mechanism by which this would have occurred. It remained, nonetheless, the company's stated position. Silkwood was flown to Los Alamos National Laboratory for more thorough testing. The results confirmed that she had internalized plutonium. Her body contained levels that would continue to irradiate her tissue for years. The medical team could not reverse this. She was 28 years old. On the night of November 13, 1974, she attended a union meeting. She was observed to have a folder of documents with her, materials she had been gathering relating to the safety violations at the plant. Witnesses at the meeting remembered the folder specifically. She left the meeting around 7 in the evening. She was driving south on Highway 74 to meet David Burnham and an AEC official. The meeting had been arranged specifically so she could hand over the documents. Her car was found in a culvert beside the highway. She was dead. She had a small amount of methaqualone, a sedative, in her blood, at a level the medical examiner described as consistent with therapeutic use, but below intoxication. The official determination was that she had fallen asleep at the wheel. A private accident investigator, hired by the union, examined the car and noted damage to the rear bumper and left rear quarter panel that he described as consistent with being struck from behind, impact distinct from the point of the car that entered the culvert. This finding was contested. The official investigation did not find it determinative. The case was closed. The documents she was carrying were not in the car. They were not found at the scene. They have not been found in the 50 years since her death. The lawsuit brought by her estate against Kerr-McGee settled in 1986 for $1.38 million. No admission of wrongdoing was part of the settlement. The plant had already closed by then, in 1975, following the publicity and investigation that followed Silkwood's death. The AEC found numerous safety violations and the plant stopped processing plutonium. Kerr-McGee exited the nuclear fuels business entirely in 1988. Karen Silkwood was 28 years old when she died. Her 3 children were living with their father in Texas. They were 7, 5, and 3. On December 30, 2019, Dr. Li Wenliang was working in the ophthalmology department at Wuhan Central Hospital in Hubei Province, China. He was an eye doctor. He treated diseases of the eye, not infectious disease. He was 33 years old. He was engaged to be married. His fiancée was pregnant with their second child. That evening, he logged into a private messaging group of former medical school classmates, roughly 150 doctors, and sent a message. He had seen reports of patients in the hospital with symptoms resembling SARS. He described the cases. He noted that several patients had been quarantined. He included what he described as a patient diagnostic report showing a positive result for a coronavirus. He told the group to warn their families and take precautions, particularly avoiding closed or crowded spaces. Within hours, the message had spread beyond the group. Screenshots were circulating on Chinese social media. By January 1st, 2020, his words were being shared widely. The Wuhan Municipal Health Commission had already issued a statement on December 31st, acknowledging a cluster of pneumonia cases of unknown cause, but stating explicitly that there was no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission and that no medical workers had been infected. On January 3, 2020, Wenliang was summoned to the Wuhan Public Security Bureau. He was asked to sign a written statement. The statement said that he had made false comments that had severely disturbed the social order and that he would not commit such illegal acts again. He signed it. He was sent back to his hospital. He went back to work. On January 8th, he treated a woman who had come in for glaucoma, elevated pressure in the eye, a routine ophthalmological case. He did not know she was infected. He did not know because the official position at that moment was that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. On January 10th, he began coughing. He developed a fever. He was tested. On January 20th, the same day Chinese authorities publicly confirmed human-to-human transmission for the first time, he tested positive for the coronavirus. His condition worsened over several weeks. He was placed on a ventilator. His parents, who had visited him before his diagnosis, also contracted the virus. His condition was critical through most of January. On February 7, 2020, Wenliang died. He was 33 years old. The Chinese government responded. A formal investigation was announced. In March 2020, the National Supervisory Commission concluded that the Wuhan police summons had been an incorrect and unlawful action. The Public Security Bureau issued a formal apology to Wenliang's family, stating that the notice he had been made to sign had been inappropriate and had been revoked. The authorities described what had happened to him as deeply regrettable. On December 30th, 2019, the day he sent the message, the official position was that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. By the time he died, 39 days later, there were over 30,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in China. The World Health Organization had declared a public health emergency of international concern. The pandemic that would ultimately kill millions of people was underway. He was not the only person who had tried to raise an early alarm. At least 8 doctors and health officials in Wuhan had sent similar warnings in December 2019. Most of their names are not widely known. Some were also summoned and warned. Several faced professional consequences. Wenliang's name became the one most attached to the story, partly because of the specific paper trail, the signed statement, the dated warning, the documented silencing, and partly because he died early enough that his death became part of the origin story in a way that was impossible to absorb quietly. His Weibo page became a public memorial after his death. People left messages. They continued leaving messages for years afterward. On his last post, written from his hospital bed, comments have accumulated at a consistent rate ever since. Many of them are simply the current date, written without other words, a small notation of continued remembrance. Many say only, "We remember." The name Roger Boisjoly is in this video because he testified publicly, because he produced documents, because his story has a clear public record. He became the face of the Challenger whistleblower account. He was not alone in that room. Arnie Thompson had also opposed the launch. Other engineers at Morton Thiokol had also raised concerns. Some of them were on the teleconference. Some of them also went home that night carrying the same knowledge Boisjoly carried. When the commission investigated and the story became public, their careers followed the same trajectory: removed from projects, reassigned, managed out through attrition or direct pressure. Their names appear in the commission transcripts if you go looking. They do not appear in the documentaries. They do not appear in the ethics textbooks. They are in the record as supporting voices, and then they are gone from the narrative. This is the structural truth about institutional whistleblowing that gets lost when we compress these stories into individual names. Boisjoly is remembered partly because he chose to testify publicly and to continue speaking for the rest of his life. The others, who also tried to stop the launch, who also had the knowledge, who also made the correct professional judgment, chose differently, or circumstances chose differently for them, and their cost is invisible and their story is not told. The mechanism that produces these stories does not require a single villain. It does not require malice in the traditional sense. It requires only an institution that has a current trajectory, a schedule, a budget, a contract, a deadline, and a person who introduces information that would require that trajectory to change. The information is received. The institution processes it through its decision structure. The decision structure prioritizes the trajectory. The information is set aside. The person who introduced it has now made themselves a problem, not because anyone has decided to harm them, but because they are associated with an obstacle. Obstacles are managed. The management tools vary. In 1847 Vienna, they involved professional ostracism and eventually commitment to an asylum. In 1974 Oklahoma, they involved, at a minimum, professional marginalization and the disappearance of evidence. In 1986, they involved exclusion from the final deliberation and subsequent isolation within the employing company. In 2019 Wuhan, they involved a summons and a document to sign. Different tools, the same function. Make the warning go away by removing the person who issued it. This video began with a quote from Roger Boisjoly. The most terrifying thing about telling the truth is not that no one will believe you. It is that they will believe you and do nothing anyway. The Rogers Commission believed him. They had his memos. They had the teleconference record. They had the temperature data and the photographs of damaged O-rings from previous missions. They confirmed everything. The shuttle program was reformed. New safety protocols were established. New management structures were mandated. They believed him. They had believed the engineers on the night of January 27th. The data was sound and the logic was clear, and every NASA official in that teleconference understood what the engineers were saying. They believed it, and they approved the launch. Boisjoly's name is not on the Challenger Memorial plaque at Cape Canaveral. Semmelweis's name is not attached to the clinical handwashing practice he invented. It is attached to a university and a statue, which is a different kind of memorial for a different kind of acknowledgement. The documents Karen Silkwood died carrying are in no archive. Wenliang's name became known not because institutions honored it, but because the grief of hundreds of millions of people was too large to disappear entirely. Her name does not appear in any textbook. It should. His name does not appear in any textbook. It should. Their names, all of them, the ones in this video and the ones who are not, the ones whose signed statements are in police files and whose memos are in commission archives and whose careers ended quietly in reassignments that led nowhere, all of them should be somewhere that does not require a search. That they are not is not an accident. After the fact, the institution acknowledges the disaster. It may even acknowledge the warning. It does not, if it can avoid it, acknowledge the cost to the person who issued the warning. Acknowledging that cost raises the question of whether the cost was necessary, and that question points back at the people who imposed it. Next video, a city in Pennsylvania called Centralia. An underground coal seam beneath the town caught fire in 1962 and has been burning ever since. The government knew. Residents reported symptoms, headaches, nausea, carbon monoxide levels rising in their basements. Some were relocated. Many were not told the full picture of what was beneath their homes. Eventually, the government condemned the properties, offered buyouts, and removed the town from official Pennsylvania maps. A small number of residents refused to leave. As of this year, they are still there. The fire beneath them is still burning. That video is next.